Our ninth talk features Barbara Kemp, senior lecturer at Oxford Brookes University, who talks on enhancing collaboration and handling conflict constructively in these challenging times.
I think we know about the current challenges, certainly for those that have attended the series of webinars, but for anybody really working at the moment in organisations, these particular challenges, they've always been there for us, but they are heightened by the current situation. So really I wanted to talk about, how does collaboration, how does conflict support handling these challenges? So next slide, please, Ali. And kind of I'm reflecting that what I'm saying isn't new, and if you have been listening to or catching up on the other webinars, the things I'm going to talk about aren't radically new or different. For me, it's a slightly different lens we're taking on some of the same issues about how do we deal with the challenges we have. And so I'm going to be touching on things like values, shared leadership, psychological safety, and so on. So when I say what is needed in the face of current challenges, it's many things, and I'm just looking at that lens of collaboration to a level perhaps not needed previously. And I think I heard Matt Sill talking about being involved in the setup of the Nightingale hospitals. I know the Army were hugely involved in those. Amazing collaboration that I think has been going on in the NHS, but in other businesses who've also been faced with how do we handle the situation which we've never experienced before? And how do we embrace conflict constructively to enhance both problem solving and support well-being? So next slide, please, Ali. So what is the nature of collaboration? And some of you may have come across the work of Jim Tam and his other colleagues and talking about radical collaboration. And what's radical about it? Well, it's just like really, really good collaboration. And Tam says at the heart for him of what collaboration is about is taking a long-term perspective. Now, of course, that's quite an interesting one because, with the NHS certainly and other businesses, haven't been able to take that longer term perspective. They've been operating very much in the short term to sort some very short term and immediate and significant issues. But I think what Tam's getting at there is collaboration within organisations and building a collaboration is really where you're trying to do things and work to sustainable longer term solutions. It's about seeking to understand others. It's about seeing others that you work with, whether they're in the same function, whether they're more senior to you or more junior to you, having this sense of others as partners, working towards the same ends, seeking solutions for mutual gain, and being open to the ideas of others. And, that is, and I know Jill last week, very good talk, and was talking about team working. And of course, collaboration does apply to within the team, but collaboration across the organisation, and then collaboration with key stakeholders in the external environment. And I guess the Army working together with the NHS, in getting Nightingale hospitals together has been an example of that collaboration externally, and many other providers. Next slide, please, Ali. So what's the case for collaboration? Ali touched on this in his introduction. It kind of seems so obvious. Why would we not want to collaborate? And yet many of us will experience, for all sorts of reasons, which I'll come on to, the very opposite of collaboration or just failure to really make it work. So, why do we want collaboration? We want to access more ideas for optimum solutions. I think we have gone far away, but not everywhere. And perhaps not in all our world leaders, that the most senior person at the top of the tree has the best ideas. So that embracing diversity, the inclusivity, let's get more ideas for optimum solutions, accessing a range of skills and knowledge, getting ownership and buy-in. And of course, if we're part of the solutions, if we're truly part of those solutions, then we are more likely to own and buy them and go along with them and really feel committed to them. Avoiding silos and duplications. And, I was talking to my two sons who are doctors, and, one of the things they talked to me was about their experience and, their different points in their careers in the NHS, but talking about, experiencing some very good teamwork within the teams they were working in, those clinical teams they were working in, but, problems of silos that we're not really working with other disciplines. And I've got to say, as a personal recipient of some fantastic care in the NHS, but also to my utter frustration of, you know, why didn't one department talk to another department? Because certainly on one of my stays, I was definitely in hospital for 3 days longer than I needed to, because someone didn't tell the people who handled the food what I needed to eat. That message didn't quite get through. You know, in 3 days for me, well, I don't know how much it costs. It's an average of £300. So if I stayed in hospital for 3 longer days than I needed to, that's £1,000 for one patient in one hospital, you know, in 1 week. Anyway, so, but a lot of you will know a lot more about that than I do. Duplication of effort, reinventing the wheel. Why are we doing that in different parts of our organizations? Reducing unproductive conflict. It is just not helpful, and yet we will have all experienced that draining of energy of us, of our colleagues, in conflict that doesn't do those things that it can do when it's handled well. And of course, collaboration really is necessary for complexity. And again, I think the current situation globally, worldwide, you know, these complex situations which, you know, most people have not experienced before. We need a lot of people, a lot of know-how working together in an extraordinary way to help deal with that. And my screen is just frozen, so I'm freezing it. There we are. So what gets in the way of collaboration? And, you know, many things, and I've put and at the bottom, because in your own areas, your own departments, your own organizations, parts of your organizations, there will be some very specific things. But these seem to me some of the common ones. Physical distance. And I know from the MBA students who are currently working in organizations across the globe are struggling sometimes where they haven't, you know, they've mainly worked co-located with their colleagues. Differing value sets, lack of shared purpose and vision, cultural differences. So, you know, within the organization, different parts of the organizational culture, and also national cultures, and those differences that come from, you know, our different upbringings, our different ethnic backgrounds. And, you know, one of the things I've hoped that we've achieved when we work on our MBA program, to try and surface some of those differences, especially cultural differences, because I think we have one of the most diverse MBA programs across the world. And let's make it okay to talk about why we see things differently, why I see your behavior differently, if we can do it in a respectful way. Silo mentality we've talked about, perceived lack of time. And I'm really struck, I was struck with catching up on Jill's webinar from last week about team working. And someone asking the question quite rightly, you know, in the NHS, it's okay perhaps in the private sector when you go off for a day, 2 days to a lovely hotel and you climb mountains or you do things like that for team building. How do we do that? You know, if we are in the public sector, not-for-profit sector, to really have that time to get together, to understand each other. Differing mindsets, different personal agendas. You know, it's a problem. Are we going to find collaborative solutions if actually my primary aim is about furthering my career, and I see working with you and giving you some kudos for coming up with some good ideas or being part of that actually could be to my detriment. So why would I want to work with you? Lack of skill and will, and I will sort of come back to this theme, but I think we've got to have the will to do it, but also there's a lot of skills, I think, and I hope some of my MBA alumni might say that, and they might have got some from working on the MBA program as well as in their life outside. You know, there's a lot of high level communication skills and other skills, psychology skills, emotional intelligence, when you're in some really challenging situations and, you know, you've got to find a way through it as a group. And organizational team processes. And I put up the picture of the bear. I don't know if you can see it because my picture of the bear is blocked by my screens of my pictures of people, but there is a picture of a bear there. And I put that there because I wanted to remind myself of a team, a dysfunctional team. They told me the dysfunctional team that asked me to come and work with them in the manufacturing sector a couple of years ago. And when I talked to one of the guys there, he said when he went into management meetings, the senior management meetings, it was like going to a bear pit. And, you know, for me, that was just, how must that be if you are experiencing that every day. And how can that possibly help achieve the challenges in your business? And, you know, that is not the only time I've experienced that in working with teams. And, you know, you all may have experienced that at times with a team or with an individual who you feel intimidated by. So next slide, Ali, please. So I don't know if you've come across this. I mentioned Jim Tam earlier, who talked about this idea of radical collaboration. And for me, this is quite interesting, especially when I think about the public sector, not-for-profit sector, charity sector. Because I think the green zone and those things that are there in the green zone about trust and collaboration and cooperation. So I'm just seeing someone saying ego is a major limitation. Yes, Eleanor, sorry, I shouldn't be distracted by chat, but I couldn't help seeing that one. And I can't remember who said, you know, as people get more senior, you often get ego expansion. Their egos expand with their seniority, as opposed to what we might hope is greater humility. So sorry, coming back to the green zone. So I think that's not any surprise that we see those words there, that we need that. The red zone, well, that was my sort of bear pit organisation. You know, when there is fear, when there's defensiveness, when you're feeling like you're going into combat and you have to defend your position. What I think is interesting about Tam's model and this idea of the pink zone, and I think it has been touched on, I think it might have been touched on by Jill in the last webinar and others, this conflict avoidance, and I do see this, I have seen this in my work more with the public sector, with charity sector, where, you know, we're all doing worthwhile things and we are there for this wonderful purpose, social purpose. But, you know, we don't like to raise conflicts and we don't like to tell someone that they're not actually performing very well or that are annoying us. So conflict sort of goes under the ground a bit. And so we get conflict avoidance and it's not dealt with and it festers, and then actually it can become really quite serious. And I've been quite shocked. And I had a friend who was an HR director, is not now in a couple of NHS trusts, and telling me that you know, the chief executive has said, we've got to get rid of this person. You know, we can't cope with them any longer. And she'd look at the kind of case, and when have they been given the feedback? They haven't. They've never been given the feedback, and it's not been tackled, but it's got so bad they've got to go. So I think that's sort of quite interesting to think about, how do we not exist in the red zone or the pink zone? Why do we tend to avoid conflict in the public sector? I'm supposed to be taking questions at the end, but can't help glancing down at them. Well, some of you may be better at answering that. I think sometimes not the tools. I mean, I work in the public sector now, in a university, and I think often there's not enough investment in management training, management development, people understanding how to have skillful conversations to deal with difficult things. And perhaps it is difficult because often there's less money for investment in training. I think often dominated by bureaucracy and fear. And yes, I better move on, because I could talk about so many examples when I've been so frustrated about that. Okay, I need to move us on. So I must not be distracted by any more questions, but thank you for asking them and making really good comments. So next slide, Ali. So how to develop collaborative working, and you know, so much we can say here. I've just picked out some points, Term and Loyat, and particularly the points they make around mindset and skills. So I think someone might be unmuted. It's a bit noisy. You need collaborative intent, and you need that at the top. Or certainly, you know, in your part of the organisation, if you haven't got real collaborative intent, it's going to be hard for it to happen. You can't, and you can have your values statement, but if people don't believe the values and live the values, you know, forget it. You've got to have openness and listening. You've got to have people taking accountability and held to account, not looking for solutions, not seeking to blame. Now I am, again, oh, sorry, can we go back? Yeah, I am sort of quite cognizant of something that came up. I think it was in the last webinar, particularly issues around the NHS, which I think is a tough one. You know, the threat of litigation, the fear of litigation, perhaps, you know, as a society, we have to rethink, certainly in the UK, about, of course, you know, people have a right if things go wrong, but, you know, does that threat of litigation and the consequences of that, does that make people defensive? I don't know, big questions there. We need self-awareness, we need awareness of others, and people do need skills there. People need to be able to explore difference in a confident way and not fear. I shouldn't notice that someone's different or comment that someone's different. That's okay if I do it in a respectful way. And problem solving and negotiating skills. And I think this ties into a point Ali made last time, for those of you who were in the last webinar. You know, doesn't it come back to leadership? And just because I run a leadership module, I might say that. But I mean, I think this has to be driven by, and Tam say this and Layat, driven by supportive, empowering leadership, a shared leadership belief, which is I do not because I've got more stripes on my uniform, or, you know, a more senior job title, or I don't have all the knowledge, you know, and that whole idea of the leader being a conductor. And also you've got to have an investment in development. People don't just naturally understand and know how to cope with work in a collaborative way. And just a few points, and I'll move on because I want to say something about conflict. And Casciano and Edmondson made some great points about, you know, again, about how you develop collaborative working. There's a lot being written about it at the moment, a lot of wisdom. And, you know, just some things there, and I'll mention a couple. Cultural brokers, having people who are really skilled at working across the organization, outside the organization, and where there is a growth mindset, because it is much easier to work in your silos. It is really difficult when you tackle some of these big challenges that go on and the politics between the organization. And then you've got some things like rotating staff, project teams, and so on. I'm going to move on because I do want some time for debate. So Ali, if we could have the next slide. Yeah, and just some points here, which I think are great points, and some great quotes from Sane, which is important. Collaborative doesn't mean we're all nice to each other. We might have some really hard discussions. So there's nothing inherently inconsistent about a culture that's both collaborative and accountability focused. Unvarnished candor is critical to innovation. There's nothing inconsistent about being frank and respectful, but you need a lot of skills to do it. And collaboration doesn't always mean consensus. But if you feel you've been consulted, if you feel you've been involved, you might be much more willing to buy into something you don't fundamentally agree with, because you know we can't always get what we want. Next slide, Ali. Thanks. I've just sort of put something there about collaboration in the virtual environment, because more and more I know team leaders, supervisors, people are to work in a more virtual way. I'm not going to say too much here, but just talk about reducing, how you reduce, which you need for collaboration. You need that understanding each other, and how do you close what's often called affinity distance when you're working virtually. And I'm not going to say too much about those. I think those points are probably self-explanatory, but you know, there's some extra challenges about doing this when we are working virtually. We have to make an effort to build that affinity, build that understanding when we're not seeing each other day to day. Next slide, please, Ali. So just going to say a few things about conflict then, healthy conflict. I think it is interesting when I do sessions around conflict, you talk about conflict, people often sort of only see it in a negative way. You know, and it was great, Ali was making the case at the introduction for positive conflict. So it depends how we define conflict, but if we define conflict as it very often is defined as difference, is being at a point of difference. And so conflict handling is about surfacing, discussing and addressing differences. And, you know, we can distinguish between issue-based conflict, i.e. I don't agree on the way forward, versus interpersonal conflict where, you know, I don't trust you, I don't like working with you, I don't believe what you say, I don't think you're being honest. You know, and people saying good conflict, Teugel and colleagues, good conflict fosters respectful debate, gets mutually agreed, solutions are often superior to those first offered. Next slide, please, Ali. Strategies for handling conflict. Certainly my MBA students would have seen this. A lot of people might have seen it. It's been around a long time, but I still think it's kind of really powerful in saying, look, you're in a conflict situation, you're at a point of disagreement. What choices have you got? You've got 5 choices. You can avoid it, you can accommodate and give in to someone else, you can force your view through if you have the power to do so, you can look for a compromise, but often compromises are sub-optimum solutions, or where it's really important, where you need a sustainable, high commitment solution, you've got to get a collaborative solution. How do you do that? Oh, last slide, I think, Ali, for those that really want to get into the debate. How do you do it? Again, you know, life is much more complex than can possibly be put on one slide, but I do think there's some points which are hopefully useful here. I do think you've always got to address the relationship conflicts before trying to deal with issue-based conflict. If I don't trust you, if I don't believe in you, then, and I don't feel that sense of you know, I can relate to you in any way, that I think things just surface. And, you know, how often, you know, do we, you know, we say we're going to agree, but actually those relationship issues surface and they bubble up time and time again. But of course, they're difficult ones to deal with, to actually say, I don't trust you. And that's why people like me, thankfully, get called in, get given some work to try and facilitate some of those really difficult conversations. But they shouldn't be difficult if they're handled early on. So we have to look for shared goals and interests. And, you know, we should look for where, you know, what are those things that we have some different perspectives, you know, if we're in a different function, if we're in finance, the finance people in the NHS versus the clinicians, I'm sure are going to have some different interests, but we've got to find those shared ones. Focus on issues, not positions. We take up a position and we get stuck in it. And, you know, I can remember when the business school was moving from one campus to another, and people took up positions for the move, against the move, rather than saying, what are the issues? The issues for people weren't for and against the move. The issues were ones of, how long is it going to take me to get to work? Where am I going to park? And am I going to feel safe at night if I have to go on public transport? So go back to issues. Seek to understand others' real concerns. And people won't always tell you their real concerns if they don't think you're really interested in them. And, you know, we do have personal concerns. You know, if I agree to this, that's fantastic, but that restructuring will result in less income for me. That's a real concern, but do I feel I can say it? Focus on areas of agreement. How often do we kind of get stuck around some areas of disagreement, but actually when we stand back and look at it, we agree on 90% of this, actually on the way forward. And I do think especially when things get a bit heated or we feel like we're getting nowhere, let's go back and just say, hang on a minute, what do we agree on? And it is surprising how that can create positivity. And then isolate the areas of disagreement, which often are quite minor. Seek creative solutions to mutual gain. Not time to talk about creativity, nor my specialism, but you know, if we just look for creative solutions, if we use some of those great techniques to free up our minds from the convergent thinking, that analytical thinking, which we spend so much time in, to divergent thinking, where we just let our minds wander. And neuroscience is telling us so much about our minds. We need to find some time to do that. And agree objective decision-making criteria. So let's not get into positions. Let's try and say, you know, whether I'm in finance, whether I'm in marketing, whether I'm a clinician, whether I'm an IT specialist, what should be the decision-making criteria that we can agree on before we start looking at what might be the ways forward. Okay, and of course, there's far more to collaborative conflict handling than that, but you know, I want to keep to time and I don't want to keep talking. I do want to leave some time for other people. So just at the end of that PowerPoint, you know, the other references I've talked about. As a good academic, I've put up my references. But I hope that's been of value. I hope it does link in. I think it does link in with many of the points that have already been talked about. And I'm really open to questions if Ali wants to switch off the screen sharing, and there are any questions perhaps that anyone has that or points.
I was going to say thank you for that, Barbara. So I'll just give a brief summary and then we can open it up to people to ask their questions. Well, you know, what I took from that was that, as all of us, the general theme throughout all these lectures is personal leadership. And what you were more or less saying, I understood, was that as personal leaders, we have to be clear about the purpose we're trying to achieve. And if we do that through very clear communication to our team, then that helps us all work together towards the same mission, whether it's building a hospital at the Nightingale, or an example today, this morning, it was to do an operation on a patient I had who was paralysed from a neck fracture, and we had the nursing team, the porters, and the nursing staff all. We have a meeting in the morning where we all clearly communicate what we want to do, so the process can be as seamless as possible. As it happened, there was a delay this morning, as often is the case, but you take these measures to reduce these steps. And if everyone is clear what's going on, there may be disagreements in the team, as you were describing. And so you have to sort of try and work out ways to overcome them. So an example this morning, when we were talking about the surgery we were going to do today, one of the nurses was particularly concerned about a kit issue and her personal protection, understandably, and that for the greater team. And so you have to listen to people who have concerns. I think it's important when there is an individual who expresses a hostility or a conflict, that as a leader, all of us should be able to listen to that, even if we disagree, and then communicate why we want to do what we wish to do. But having heard the person who's got the conflict, and then address the concerns head on, rather than just brush it off. Because I think that if you just brush things off, then people internalize that and it can perpetuate problems. But if you listen to an individual and you respect their point of view, even if it's different, it's a way to overcome a conflict that may, should we say, get bigger as time goes on. So, you know, I felt that that was really helpful, sort of in terms of the general themes of creating this purpose, understanding that we are, as individuals, working in teams, and then how we may address some of the issues that teams may face. So I do appreciate the time you've taken to talk to us, and I'd be very interested to hear what people have got to say and questions they may have about their personal experiences of working in teams, cross-collaboration and hostilities. So I open it up to the floor.
Right. I just want to pick up on one. Thank you so much, Barbara, for this. This is a really engaging conversation. So if there's anybody that wants to ask anything and you don't want to vocalize that, you can actually ask in the chat box. But I want to go back to Brandon's question, if I can find it. Brandon, if you're still here, if you can unmute yourself and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, I can see him.
Brandon. Hey, hi, Brandon. Do you want to ask your question?
Maybe he's on mute, is he?
I believe he's unmuted.
Brandon?
Okay, so I'll ask a question. So some of my co-workers...
can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah, we can, Brandon.
Yes.
Yeah. So my question was basically, some of my colleagues aren't that collaborative. So what are some recommendations that you can make to encourage collaboration amongst colleagues?
Well, I always think people, my kind of fundamental thing with people is people do things for a reason. So if people are not collaborative, then it kind of seems pretty good. And if you work in a collaborative, got some echoes and things, if you work in a collaborative team and you get better solutions and you get support from your colleagues, why is it people aren't collaborating? And so I don't think there's a simple solution, Brandon. I would say, I would want to talk to my colleagues to say, you know, why do you operate in that way? Why do you behave in that way? And can we just have a debate about what collaboration is, you know, why we don't? And because there may be many reasons. And, you know, it may be that, and I've seen competitive environments where people won't collaborate because they feel that they won't get on if they help someone else. I mean, if I could just give a very small example of a banking sector I worked in with a team, and they were seen, these very senior and very able people, as not getting on. And it was obvious to staff around them. And the boss said, right, we've got to do something around this. And so I went in and we did some team building stuff. And do you know what, actually, what it came, when we sat in a room and we talked about it, it came down to the fact they were all incentivized individually on some very, very big incentives, which didn't include anything, no team incentives. So they said, why am I going to work and help them achieve that if that's actually might work against me achieving some of my, you know. And what was interesting though, because I know, you know, bankers often get a bad name, and so actually they said, we would like some team goals. You know, we don't think this is healthy, and we would genuinely like to collaborate more. So let's work to some team goals. You know, it just sounds so blinking obvious, but they'd never been sat in a room, they'd never discussed it. So I don't know, Brandon, if that helps at all, but you can't solve a problem until you know the reason why and find out why.
Could I come in on this, Barbara? I'd like to really join in this conversation.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, conflict is a primeval instinct. If you look at creation all around you, everybody's fighting for survival. It's the very bottom level, if you like, of conflict within the Maslow's needs of hierarchical needs. So, I mean, conflict did arise from the want to begin with of food, of survival. And it's a primeval instinct that has actually continued with us. And I suppose that's, you know, what separates, you could argue, the chimp brain, what's generating the hippocampus, to the frontal cortex, which is about thinking. And it is a primeval instinct. And I think it takes a culture, it takes, if you like, a very strong leadership to be able to bring that culture of having to find that shared purpose and then collaborate with one another. I think it's down to the individual context. And my worry is, I'd love to actually have an opinion from the floor, that when we emerge out of the lockdown, when we actually start to face the realities, when we have, if you like, some of our, you could argue, personal freedoms or financial comforts, having to compete pretty much to maintain that standard, what happens then? Will we be a more collaborative society, which we should be, or will we end up with conflict?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one, because I've been thinking about that a lot lately, because as part of doing an MBA, you know, it's like, what am I going to do next? And so what opportunities are created from this situation? I've got, I'm business continuity accredited, so, you know, it would seem obvious to go down that route, but I'm very interested in kind of creating an ecosystem which is completely contrary to that idea of competitiveness. And just to go back slightly on what we were talking about sort of changing people's behaviours, I think you're right. We are sort of born slightly combative, and I think if you're looking for others to change their behaviour, I think it's sort of, you have to kind of lead by example. When addressing collaborativeness specifically, because, you know, in my experience, when I've wanted to work differently with other people, I've made the first move. So I've kind of given away to kind of gain. It's that reciprocity, isn't it? So I'm going to give you information. I'm going to give you my time. I'm going to collaborate with you. I might have some bandwidth. So what can I do for you for nothing? In the hope that it's going to generate that type of relationship. And actually 9 times out of 10 it does. And when it doesn't, you know, there's usually, you know, a really ingrained kind of, you know, there is that maybe an ego at play that you just can't penetrate. And I think then you have to make a decision about, is this someone I have to work with and I have to work with in this way, or is it, you know, am I just going to give up and walk away? But I think it starts with you. If you want to change someone's behavior or change a way of working, you have to give up first. You have to, you know, and that is contrary to that that instinct of being combative or being competitive, where actually your instinct is to hold your ground.
Thank you, Barbara, so much for this talk. Could I just pass on to Ali so he can just go through what we are going to be talking about next week? Thank you so much again for all being here. And just hang on 1 second, we will be showing you what's going on next week. Our talk for next week.
I'm trying to get the screen to share. I'll just stop sharing and then we'll go back. In a nutshell, we've got from Birmingham next week, Adrian Plunke, who is a consultant anesthetist, and he has started an organization. Some of you might have heard of it, called Learning from Excellence. Now, it again boils down to the insecurities that we were talking about earlier. a lack of psychological safety. And some of you might actually think a lack of psychological safety comes up, or we come into a lack of psychological safety from the fear of being criticized, from the fear of what some people might argue clinical governance has become, where we are focusing on our errors to learn. But learning from excellence's philosophy is about learning from what you've done well, sharing that between yourself, giving yourself that positive feedback, but also sharing with others, celebrating your successes. So we'll be hearing Adrian Plunkett next week in Birmingham. Does anyone have any further points that they'd like to raise? Barbara, we've got 1 or 2 minutes more. No, it's turned 7 o'clock, so I wish you all the very best. Obviously, have safe journeys into work tomorrow, and we look forward to seeing you at 6 o'clock next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you for attending, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara, for the fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you all for the fantastic session.